Before there were thrones of gold and libraries of wisdom, before Mansa Musa's name glimmered in foreign tongues, there was only the land, vast, dry, humming with memory. The Sahel stretched like an ancient parchment, cradled between desert and jungle, neither barren nor lush, but something in between. A place of crossings, a place of tension, a place where empires would one day rise, shaped not by swords alone, but by salt and sun and song. Long before Mali had a name, there was Ghana, not the modern nation, but the empire of old, born of iron and river trade. Its kings were rich, its warriors feared, its cities surrounded by walls of packed earth and prayer. They traded in silence with Berber merchants from the north. Gold flowed like grain, silent as the wind over dunes. But time, as always, gnawed patiently. Ghana's strength waned, worn thin by rebellion, pressure from Almoravid incursions, and shifting sands of loyalty. To the southeast, small Mandinka clans stirred. Among them, in a place called Kangaba, a dynasty gathered itself from the dust. These were people of speech and rhythm, of oral law and sacred hunters, of sun-baked millet fields and rain drums echoing in the dusk. They had no crown then, no palace, but they had memory, and in memory, they found power. The Niger River curled through the land like a lifeline, feeding soil and souls alike. Its waters birthed settlements, towns that traded fish for salt, cloth for cola, ideas for grain. In these marketplaces, surrounded by baobab trees and the chatter of merchants, people met not only to exchange goods, but truths. There were traders from the Sahara, cloaked in blue, from forest kingdoms in the south, bearing ivory, and from the east, whispering of places called Cairo and Mecca. Islam had arrived, not through conquest, but through commerce. Soft-footed scholars, traveling merchants, and Sufi mystics carried the faith like hidden treasure, offering it gently to ears that listened. Some accepted it fully, building mosques of mud brick and prayer. Others folded it into older beliefs, mingling the new with the ancestral. And still others watched with caution, letting the change drift through their towns like a dry, season breeze. There was no Mali yet, but there were signs. Cattle were raised, iron was forged. The hunters' guilds, keepers of the bush and the spirit world, held ceremonies that pulsed through the night. Children were taught stories not from paper, but from mouths. Griots reciting generations with fire in their voices, calling forth names of heroes who had not yet lived. In this soil, the seed of empire lay. Kangoiba, once a small village on the edge of memory, began to matter. Its people, Mandinka by blood and bound by oaths, grew restless. The decline of Ghana left a vacuum, and history abhors a vacuum. Raids became more frequent. Clans began to test the edges of their neighbours. And then came a name, whispered more than spoken, Sumaro Kante. He was no Mandinka. He ruled the Soso, a rising force that had clawed its way into the old Ghanaian holdings. A man of fire, feared more than loved. He collected kings as one collects ivory, absorbing their lands and spirits. Stories say he wore fetishes of fallen foes, that his court was filled with silence and eyes that dared not meet his. His rise was a shadow spreading. The Mandinka resisted, but they were divided. Among them was a family, royal by blood, but hunted. The Kita line, descended from hunters, from noble speech, from forgotten kings. A prophecy spoke of a child born from a woman who could not walk, and a man who spoke to spirits. When the child came, he was slow to rise, slow to speak, his limbs like reeds. But he watched, and when he did speak, his words did not tremble. His name was Sundiata. But this is not yet his story. That will come when the land has bled enough. What matters now is that Molly, as an idea, was forming. In the winds that blew over Kangaba, in the iron blades forged by firelit hands, in the traders who walked under stars from Wallata to Jenne, in the old men who remembered Ghana's fall, and the young who dreamed of something greater. It lived in the songs of griots, who spoke of a time not yet come, but certain as the sunrise, a time when the land would be gathered again, not in fragments, but in purpose, and deep in the silence of the forests and the hum of the savannah, the ancestors listened, waiting. He watched, and when he did speak, his words did not tremble. His name was Sundiata. But this is not yet his story. That will come when the land has bled enough. What matters now is that Molly, as an idea, was forming. In the winds that blew over Kangoba, in the iron blades forged by firelit hands, in the traders who walked under stars from Wallata to Jenne, in the old men who remembered Ghana's fall, and the young who dreamed of something greater. It lived in the songs of griots, who spoke of a time not yet come, but certain as the sunrise. A time when the land would be gathered again, not in fragments, but in purpose, and deep in the silence of the forests and the hum of the savannah, the ancestors listened, waiting. Yet what gave Mali its shape before it had walls or kings was not conquest, but connection. The trans-Saharan roots stitched together worlds that otherwise might never have touched. Tuareg caravans brought Saharan salt in slabs the size of shields. Southern traders brought gold dust in leather pouches, weighed in secret, guarded by oaths. Slaves moved silently, shadows in chains. Horses were rare, sacred, powerful. And with every step and every trade, Mali became more than a region. It became a crossroad, a place where everything passed through and nothing left unchanged. Religion, too, travelled those roads. Islam came not by sword but by invitation, layered into the lives of chiefs and merchants. Slowly, the Friday prayer became familiar. Arabic scripts appeared beside local signs. Names changed, practices adjusted, but the old ways, the ways of the land, did not vanish. They folded, waited, adapted. Mali would not rise as a copy of other empires. It would rise as itself, rooted in the soil of its own rhythm. Even now, before its name was carved into time, you could hear it, in the clash of iron, in the murmur of markets, in the deep drums that echoed across the plains at dusk. A slow pulse, gathering strength, a silence about to speak. They called him crippled, said he would never walk, the boy of prophecy, born to a hunchback queen, with legs like rope and a tongue that waited too long to speak. While other children ran through millet fields and mimicked warriors with sticks, Sundiata Keita crawled. He listened. He watched. His silence was not weakness. It was gathering. His father, Magan Konfata, king of Kangoba, believed in the prophecy that a child from an unlikely mother would carry the future of the Mande. But kings die, and when they die, vultures circle. After Magan's death, Sundiata's stepmother took the throne for her own son, and Sundiata and his mother were cast out, wandering from court to court, exiles without shelter, royal in blood, but forgotten by fate. Across the savannas and dry hills of West Africa, Sundiata learned not from scribes, but from movement. From strangers and sages, from hunters and traders, he saw how kingdoms rose and fell, how men followed courage more than crowns, how the land, though wide, remembered those who walked it with honor. And then one day, he stood. The legend says it happened like thunder. He pulled himself upright with an iron staff, his legs trembling but defiant. The boy they mocked became the man who would return. But before return came rage. Sumaro Conte, the sorcerer king of the Soso, had begun his dark rise. With cruelty and force, he conquered neighboring kingdoms, burning shrines and enslaving the free. His power was more than military. It was said he wielded talismans of ancient spirits, that his enemies dropped dead before battle, that he kept the skulls of kings for drink. He invaded Mali, took the lands of the Mandinka, cast fear like a shadow over the region, and in that darkness, messages were sent. Across rivers and forests, griots whispered Sundiata must return, and return he did, not as a prince in silk, but as a leader forged in exile. He gathered allies, old generals, rebel chiefs, warriors tired of fear. From the heart of Mande to the edges of the Sahel, the call rang out. Horses were mounted, spears sharpened. The drums of war beat like hearts ready to break cages. In 1235, it came to a single moment. A battlefield near Karina, where two visions of the world clashed, tyranny against justice, darkness against dawn. Sumaro stood with sorcery and steel. Sundiata came with a coalition of the willing, men who had tasted defeat and refused to swallow it again. The battle was not clean. Spears flew, men cried out, dust swallowed the horizon. It was not one strike, but many. Not one hero, but hundreds. But in the end, Sumaro was broken. Some say he vanished into the mountains, his powers shattered. Others say he was slain, his talismans powerless before the will of the people. What mattered was what came after. At Kangoba, beneath the baobab trees, a great council was called. 12 kings, once rivals, now stood side by side. They pledged loyalty not just to Sundiata, but to a vision. One of unity, peace, law. The Empire of Mali was born, not by inheritance, but by consensus, by necessity, by blood paid and hope promised. Sundiata was crowned Mansa, emperor. But more than that, he became the lawgiver, the unifier, the one who turned scattered peoples into a nation. He did not erase traditions, he honored them. The hunter's law, the griot's voice, the merchant's path, all had a place. Islam was respected, so were the elders of the land. It was balance, not domination. The Kurukan Fuga, a charter of governance, was proclaimed. Long before Europe's Magna Carta, Mali had a system that outlined rights, roles, and respect. Nobles could advise, farmers could rest, slaves had protection, women had voices. It was not perfect, but it was order, and beneath that order, Mali began to move. Caravans resumed. Salt flowed from the north. Gold gleamed in the riverbeds. Towns like Niani and Dejene pulsed with trade. Sundiata built roads, posts, granaries. He ruled not just by decree, but by listening. He visited provinces. He spoke with sages. He governed with humility. He reigned for 2 decades, then faded like all men must. But unlike most, he left a foundation, and above all, he left a story. The lion who could not walk, who rose, who fought, who united. The first heartbeat of an empire that would one day stun the world. After the dust of Karina settled and the cries of war faded into memory, Mali stood, still raw, still trembling, but no longer scattered. Sundiata Keita did not seize the throne in arrogance. He accepted it like a man cradling something sacred. He knew that the true test was not victory, but permanence. He built his empire not with chains but with threads. Delicate, deliberate, human. He travelled from village to village, not as a conqueror, but as a reconciler. Where others would have razed cities, he restored markets. Where others would have silenced rivals, he invited them to counsel. The strength of Mali would not come from a single city, but from 1,000 loyalties woven like cloth, each patch stitched by speech and promise. The griots tell us he sat beneath the shade of a massive tree. A circle of kings gathered around him. The Kurokan Fuga, they called it. A constitution long before parchment ruled men's lives. There, roles were assigned: nobles, smiths, griots, warriors, farmers, slaves, all placed in a social fabric defined by function, not by cruelty. Justice was made public. Decisions were made through deliberation, not behind walls, but before the people. And from this council, Sundiata decreed that the empire would protect the faith. Islam, though not yet universal in Mali, was to be honoured. He appointed Qadis, judges of Islamic law, in Muslim-majority towns. Mosques were permitted to flourish, but he did not force belief. His own path walked a line between the sacred traditions of the land and the reverence for the one God of Islam. For Sundiata, Islam was not a weapon. It was a bridge. He respected the marabouts, the scholars, the mystics who came with knowledge and mercy. He allowed the call to prayer to echo beside the beat of ancestral drums. He let the Quran be recited beside the stories of spirits in the bush. This was his genius, not suppression, but synthesis. Yet Sundiata was not a dreamer without edge. He understood power. Under his leadership, Mali's military grew in discipline and size. Cavalry patrolled the open roads, and infantry guarded trade towns. Fortresses were built not for show, but for defense. The empire stretched outward, not in hunger, but in strategy. East toward Gao, north to the fringes of the Sahara, and south into the forested lands, where the rivers whispered of gold. Niani, his capital, bloomed like a desert flower. Built along the riverbank, it became a seat of learning, of law, of wealth. Artisans from the forest kingdoms came with carved wood and ivory. Berber traders brought silk and horses. The sound of the adhan joined the clatter of market stalls and the hum of griot songs beneath the stars. In Niani's heart stood the royal compound. Mud brick walls polished until they shone like bronze in the sun. But it was not the walls that made it a palace. It was the stories. For every stone held a memory. Every corner whispered a name. It was a living archive of a people, beginning to know who they were. And the empire began to teach its children. Scribes recorded genealogies, traders memorized the constellations above the desert, and griots walked with kings, their voices holding the past like embers from which fire could be kindled again. Knowledge, once passed only by tongue, now met ink. In a world before borders were drawn on maps, Mali drew its identity in speech, in justice, and in faith. Still, Mali was not without tension. The balance between tradition and Islam required constant care. Some feared that the old ways were being swallowed. Others believed the empire did not embrace Islam fully enough, but Sundiata held firm. He did not govern belief, he governed coexistence. As the empire grew, so too did its symbol, a lion walking beside the moon. Power tempered by wisdom, law walking with mercy. In the minds of other kings, Sundiata was more than a man. He became legend. And within Mali, he became the first line of every griot's chant, the name that unlocked the story of a people who had turned exile into strength and prophecy into statehood. When he died, the people wept, not for a king lost, but for an era completed. They buried him in secret, as was their way, and his tomb remains hidden, perhaps guarded by wind, by time, or by the prayers of those he once protected. But his empire did not sleep. His reforms held, his cities flourished, his name endured, and from that name would rise generations of emperors, some great, some flawed, but all walking in his long, deliberate shadow. Sundiata did not build Mali for himself. He built it to outlive him. After Sundiata's burial, its location veiled in silence and salt, the empire did not crumble, as so many do when their founders fall. Instead, it ripened. What he had forged through vision and consent, his successors nourished with administration, steel, and steady hands. The Mali Empire was no longer a name whispered beneath trees. It was a presence, a structure, a pulse that beat from river to desert. The title of Mansa, once new, became sanctified. The Kita lineage ruled, but not unchecked. Power in Mali was not absolute. It was a dialogue, between nobles and kings, between tribes and crown, between the past and the present. The Kurukan Foga remained the backbone of governance, a living document shaped by voice, by memory, and by need. Each province, or kofu, had its governor, appointed by the Mansa, but accountable to the law. These men ruled not with their own whims, but under the weight of responsibility. Beneath them, local chiefs retained influence, their authority respected so long as they bowed to the empire's center. It was a web of loyalties, not a chain of commands, a decentralized unity, strong because it bent without breaking. The army grew not just in size, but in shape. The cavalry, its heart, was swift and terrifying. Horses bred along the Niger, trained to ride in formations that moved like storm clouds. Infantry carried javelins, bows, shields of hide and wood. Some units specialized in ambushes in forest terrain, others in open, field charges across the Sahel. It was not a machine, it was a rhythm, a force that matched terrain with strategy. But it was not war that built Mali's fame, it was trade. With Ghana's collapse and Mali's rise, the goldfields of Bambok and Bure now lay fully within imperial reach. Gold was not merely mined, it was managed. The Mansa controlled the nuggets, only gold dust could circulate freely. It was a quiet monopoly that fed cities and funded armies. From the deep forest mines to the markets of Niani, gold moved in pouches, in baskets, in silence. And from Niani, it journeyed farther. Salt flowed south from Tagaza, carved in shimmering white slabs, stacked on camel caravans like blocks of ice. Copper came from Takeda. Slaves, tragically, were bartered along the same routes. So were hides, cola nuts, ivory, textiles, and ideas. At the heart of this movement stood Mali's growing trade cities Djenne, nestled near the Bani River, its mosque like a mountain of earth and faith. Walata, the desert outpost, where Berbers gathered in cloaks of indigo, and most of all Timbuktu, still young but beginning to hum with potential. Caravans moved like clockwork, merchants followed stars, markets opened at dawn with calls in Arabic, Mande, Fulani, Songhai, and Tuareg. It was not merely commerce, it was culture. People ate together, prayed together, argued, married, studied, and dreamed beneath the shade of thatched stalls and stone buildings. Islam continued its steady rise, not by edict, but by elegance. The Quran entered homes alongside storytelling. Mosques began to shape skylines. Marabouts taught not only theology, but medicine, astronomy, ethics. Children learned to write Arabic letters in the sand with their fingers, tracing verses before the winds took them. Still, the old beliefs did not vanish. In remote villages, drums still summoned spirits. Ancestral shrines remained sacred. Diviners read the patterns of cowrie shells, even as Quranic verses were recited over sick beds. It was not confusion, it was continuity. Mali allowed room for both, as long as peace was kept. The Khita dynasty, strengthened by this balance, held the throne through skillful succession. Not all were equal. Some reigned briefly, others poorly, but none undid what Sundiata had begun. The system could absorb flaws. It had momentum. Mali was not just ruled, it was lived, and beyond its borders, others began to take notice. North, in the courts of Fez and Cairo, whispers began. There is a black empire in the south where gold is as common as dust. Sailors from Venice and Genoa drew maps with blank spaces marked only by gold nuggets and a name they didn't yet know how to spell. In the east, pilgrims returning from the Hajj spoke of kings in the west who prayed as they did, who spoke Arabic, who governed vast lands but remained humble in the face of faith. The world was beginning to tilt toward Mali. But within, the people still lived their days not in grandeur, but in rhythm. Farmers rose before dawn. Women pounded millet in great wooden mortars. Smiths sang to their fire. Fishermen cast nets as they always had. Griots sat by the fire, naming ancestors and telling tales. Because even as an empire, Mali remained human. It remained Mandé, and its greatness was not in how loud it roared, but how clearly it remembered its roots. The roots of Sundiata, of unity, of balance, of justice that listened and law that endured. Soon, a name would rise that would carry Mali beyond legend. Mansa Musa. But first, the empire had to breathe, to gather itself, to become the kind of soil from which legend could grow. It is easy to remember Mali as an empire of gold and grandeur. But before the caravans gleamed, before the maps turned toward it in wonder, Mali had to become a body, with veins and breath, with muscle and pulse. That body was not born from conquest alone. It was built through systems, quiet, deliberate, unglamorous. Bureaucracy, diplomacy, and daily labor. These were the bricks beneath the gold. By the early 1300s, Mali was no longer a regional power. It was a machine that moved with remarkable precision. Its domain stretched over 2,000 kilometers. From the lush banks of the Senegal River, in the west to the arid fringes of Lake Chad in the east, Mali's reach enveloped dozens of peoples. Soninke, Fulani, Bambara, Mossi, Tuareg, and more. Some were absorbed through negotiation. Others bowed after resistance. But the empire did not flatten its subjects. It wove them in. Each region kept its language, its music, its customs. The center did not demand sameness. It demanded loyalty and tribute. In exchange, it offered roads, order, markets, and the protection of imperial arms. Governors, called farbers, were assigned to major cities and regions. These men acted as eyes and ears of the Mansa, and each had underlings responsible for tax collection, court justice, military oversight, and religious affairs. Taxes were collected not in coin, but in kind: bundles of grain, hides, bolts of cloth, sacks of salt. Caravans, laden with goods, came to Niani and other administrative centers, where treasuries stored wealth not just in gold, but in necessities. It was said that during times of drought, the Mansa could feed entire provinces from imperial reserves. This was not mere prosperity. It was planning. And that prosperity did not remain within walls. Mali's rulers understood that the world was wide, and that power meant little if it was not seen. Diplomacy, therefore, became a craft. Envoys from Mali visited the courts of North Africa and beyond. They spoke in Arabic, carried gifts of ivory, gold dust, and embroidered cloth. They forged bonds with Berber tribes, with Egyptian viziers, with merchants in the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. These were not symbolic gestures. They kept trade routes smooth. They protected Mali's caravans from raids. They ensured favorable terms for exports. And more than that, they announced Mali's presence. A message carried on the backs of camels and the voices of travelers. There is an empire in the south that prays, that governs, that thrives. At home, the empire pulsed with daily motion. Great markets in Djenné, Jau, and eventually Timbuktu overflowed with goods. Arab merchants noted the discipline of trade there. Prices set with fairness. Disputes settled with swift justice. Shouting was frowned upon. Haggling was precise, not wild. Markets were sacred spaces of exchange, economic, social, even spiritual. Craftsmen thrived. Blacksmiths held in near, mystical esteem, forged weapons, tools, and ornaments. Weavers created complex patterns with dyed cotton. Potters shaped water vessels, their forms unchanged for generations. Builders molded earth into walls so smooth they reflected the sun like bronze. Every village had its rhythm, and every rhythm fed the empire. Education, too, was no accident. Though Mali did not yet have the sprawling libraries it would soon be known for, learning was treasured. Arabic literacy was spreading. Young boys learned to recite the Quran under the guidance of marabouts. Some travelled to centres like Walata or Timbuktu to study fiqh, Islamic law, grammar, and poetry. The Griots, meanwhile, continued their own form of scholarship, oral, passionate, precise. They remembered. That was their power. They held the genealogy of nobles, the history of battles, the teachings of the past. They did not simply entertain. They safeguarded identity. No ceremony, no coronation. No treaty felt real until a Grayot gave it voice. As Mali's structure solidified, so did its confidence. New cities were commissioned. Roads were widened. Relays were established, with messengers on horseback able to carry news across hundreds of miles in days. There was no printed word, no radio, no wires, but information flowed. News of harvests, of disputes, of border tensions. Mali knew itself, and that knowing was its armour. Justice, too, was a matter of pride. Disputes were settled in open courts, where plaintiffs and defendants spoke freely. Witnesses were called. Elders presided. In Muslim, majority towns, Qadis ruled based on Islamic law. Elsewhere, traditional councils handled cases. There was a balance, a flexibility, a practical wisdom that favoured peace over punishment. And above it all, the Mansa. Though Mali's strength came from many, its centre still mattered. The Mansa's face was rarely seen by commoners, but his decisions shaped their world. He was not just a king, he was the shepherd of stability. His word could redirect rivers of policy. His absence could invite chaos, so Mali kept watch. And when a Mansa ruled well, the land bloomed. In these years, the empire reached its most stable form, not yet at its most famous, but at its most secure. Like a tree rooted deep before its branches reach for the heavens, Mali in this stage was preparing itself. It had endured storms. It had healed divisions. It had learned to govern. And now, it was ready for something more. For a man whose name would eclipse all others. A pilgrimage that would shake the world. a moment when Mali would no longer whisper, but roar. He was not the first to wear the crown, but he would become the most remembered. Mansa Musa. His name would echo across oceans, his deeds inked in foreign scripts, his legacy confused by myth yet rooted in staggering truth. He inherited an empire already strong, already vast. But under his hand, Mali would become immortal. Musa came to power around 1312, likely as a deputy ruler appointed during the previous Mansa's absence. When his predecessor, Abubakar II, embarked on an ambitious voyage into the Atlantic and never returned, Musa ascended. Not through revolution, but readiness. He did not need to carve his name with the sword. He would engrave it in gold, and gold Mali had. From the mines of Bambok, from Bura, from dust panned in rivers, from tribute paid by vassal states, from trade that never ceased. Under Musa's reign, this wealth became a tool of expansion. Military, economic, and spiritual. He understood, better than most, the value of perception. The world knew of Mali, but it had not yet seen it. So in 1324, Musa did what no Saharan ruler had done with such ambition. He undertook the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. It was an act of faith, yes, but also of diplomacy, of declaration. He would not go quietly. The caravan he assembled became the stuff of legend. Accounts vary wildly. Some say he took 60,000 men. Others claim 100 camels, carried 300 pounds of gold each. But behind the exaggeration lies a truth. Musa's procession dazzled every city it touched. Gold flowed like rain. Coins were minted and handed out freely. Robes of embroidered silk were gifted to local rulers. Mosques were funded. Scholars were paid. The streets of Cairo buzzed with wonder and chaos. In fact, Musa spent so much gold in Egypt that he devalued the dinar for a decade. Inflation surged. Historians from Granada to Constantinople recorded the disruption, and with it, they recorded his name. They ask, who is this black king from the south? And in maps drawn in Florence, in Catalonia, in Venice, a figure appeared. A man seated on a golden throne, orb in hand, labelled Rex Meli, King of Mali. But Musa did not go on Hajj merely to spend. He returned with scholars, architects, poets, and books. From Cairo, he brought the renowned architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who helped reshape the empire's urban centers. Under Musa's command, the Great Mosque of Timbuktu, also known as Jingareba, was constructed. It was built not only as a house of worship, but as a beacon of Mali's arrival into the Islamic intellectual world. Upon his return, Musa embarked on a transformation of Mali. He funded madrasas, encouraged Arabic literacy, and established endowments for Islamic education. He built or restored mosques in Jau, Niani, and Djenné. Timbuktu began its rise as a city of knowledge, where traders would someday share space with scholars, and manuscripts would be valued like gold. But he did not forsake tradition. Local customs remained honored. Griots continued to speak. Tribal structures endured beneath the imperial framework. He did not erase Mali's past. He expanded its future, and he maintained control. Mali's borders expanded under his reign to include parts of what are now Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Burkina Faso. Vassal kingdoms paid tribute, knowing rebellion would not be tolerated. The military remained strong, but it was Musa's presence, his mix of piety and precision, that commanded the most loyalty. Trade routes flourished. Gold, salt, ivory, leather, and slaves moved with speed and safety. With roads secured and diplomacy extended, Mali grew richer not just in wealth but in reputation. Foreign merchants came to its cities with curiosity and awe. Pilgrims paused in Timbuktu not only to rest, but to learn. The world's idea of Africa was being redrawn, and Musa's hand held the quill. He ruled for more than 2 decades, and when he died, sometime around 1337, the empire did not collapse. His sons inherited an empire vast, respected, and complex. But they could not match his presence. Musa had become more than emperor. He was Mali's golden myth, living and luminous. And though Europe would later forget his name, replacing it with shadows and silence, the manuscripts in Timbuktu would remember. The griots would remember. And the maps of old, with their golden king in the south, would remember. Because Mansa Musa was not merely a ruler. He was Mali made visible. A man who walked across a continent and returned with the world at his feet. Long before the engines of empire rode in Europe, before tall ships sailed from Lisbon and Seville in search of distant spice, there was already a web of trade that stitched the world together. From China to Cairo, from India to Morocco, and in the heart of West Africa, glowing with wealth and motion, stood Mali. It was not wealth in theory, but wealth in action. Gold. Mali's lifeblood did not sit idle in vaults. It moved, panned from rivers, dug from mines, carried in dust and nugget, traded for salt, cloth, horses, books. It travelled with the caravans. Thousands of camels stretched like a line of ants across the burning skin of the Sahara. Every grain of gold pulled more of the world toward Mali. The empire's mines in Bambuk, Bure, and Galam were not simply holes in the earth. They were worlds of labour and control. The Mansa retained ownership of the raw gold. Ordinary people could trade in dust, but all large pieces belonged to the empire. This monopoly ensured stability. Gold remained a national asset, not a chaotic flood. But gold, for all its glow, needed its twin, salt. In a land where heat crushed the body and sweat poured freely, salt was survival. It preserved meat, balanced the body, and, in many cases, was worth its weight in gold. From the salt mines of Tagaza and Taudeni in the deep Sahara, Berber and Tuareg traders cut slabs of salt from beneath blistering crusts, packed them onto camels, and made the long journey south. These caravans, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, were feats of human endurance and logistical genius. Each camel carried up to 300 pounds of cargo. Traders timed their routes with the seasons, their paths mapped not by rivers or trees, but by stars and sand ridges. Entire towns emerged around caravan stops, places of water, rest, and exchange, and waiting at the southern terminus of these journeys were Mali's great cities, Djen, Jo Niani, and increasingly, Timbuktu. In Djenné, the river curled like a silver ribbon through the market. Merchants from the forest brought kola nuts, ivory, and hides. From the Sahel came horses, slaves, and cotton. From the Sahara came salt and books. And across the sea of dunes, through North Africa, flowed souks, glassware, fine swords, and spices from even farther away. Everything met in Mali. Trade in these cities wasn't loud chaos, it was ritual. Prices were often set in silence, with sellers placing their goods and buyers placing gold beside them, returning later to see if the offer was accepted. Disputes were rare, markets were policed. Theft was punished swiftly but fairly, and behind this activity was a sophisticated logistics system. The empire maintained roads and way stations, shelters for travelers and places for animals to drink. Messengers sometimes running on foot, carried information between cities in astonishing time. Foreign visitors remarked on the efficiency of this system. It was a far cry from the image later drawn of Africa by outsiders. This was structure, order, and foresight. Slavery, too, was part of this system, it must be said. Mali's wealth did not rise without the pain of others. Slaves were captured in war or born into bondage, sold north across the desert, or kept within the empire. Many served in households, in the fields, or as soldiers. In some cases, they could gain their freedom, but for many, the system was harsh and enduring. Yet the trade economy also birthed culture. Merchants were not mere traders. They were carriers of ideas. From North Africa came scholars and scribes, bearing not only Qur'ans, but astronomy texts, philosophy, maps. They mingled in Mali's markets with griots and sages, and the empire's cities became incubators of exchange, economic and intellectual. The presence of Islam among traders helped establish trust. Contracts were honored by word and faith. The Friday prayer was observed, even in markets. The mosque was often the heart of a commercial district. Religion was not separate from commerce, it anchored it. Gold fed more than trade. It built mosques, funded madrasas, and paid for the copying of manuscripts. The manuscript culture in Mali began to flower, especially in Timbuktu. Texts covered theology, law, medicine, geography, and poetry. Libraries began to emerge, not just as royal possessions, but as public institutions. Foreign chroniclers like Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in the mid-14th century, marveled at the civility, the structure, the respect for law. He noted the dignity of its people, their commitment to justice, their knowledge of Islam. In his words, Mali was not a backwater, it was a beacon, and through it all, the empire's arteries pulsed with movement. Camels groaned beneath salt slabs. Children played near gold dust sieves. Scribes dipped reed pens into ink. The muezzin's call lifted above the clang of trade. Smoke curled from cook fires, and the scent of millet and roasted meat drifted down alleyways. This was the golden age of Mali, not an age of isolation, but of interconnection. An empire that had become not just a place on a map, but a hub of the world. When gold whispers, the world listens. But when it roars, as it did through Mali, the echo reaches beyond deserts, overseas, and into the pages of civilizations yet unborn. The Mali Empire did not merely grow rich. It reshaped how others understood the world. It bent the gaze of geographers. It altered economic currents, and it forced distant empires to redraw the edges of what they thought possible. In the years following Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, Mali became something more than a powerful empire. It became a legend. Traders in Cairo, Damascus, and Venice spoke of an African kingdom where gold dust was as common as sand. Cartographers in Catalonia drew Musa on his throne, crowned and orb-bearing, seated regally in a land most Europeans had never seen. Mali became a mythic horizon, not for what it promised in fantasy, but for what it had already proven. That black kings could rule wisely, that Muslim empires could thrive below the Sahara, and that civilization was not a European invention. It was human. But this global awe didn't rest only on imagery. It rested on connection. Mali's wealth flowed into North African markets, where gold coins stamped in Cairo bore Mali's dust. That same gold helped fund Mamluk expansion, supported scholars in Al-Azhar, and bankrolled trade routes that reached as far as Persia and India. In some ways, West African gold became the bloodstream of the Islamic world, and where gold flowed, so did curiosity. Pilgrims who had seen Musa's caravans spoke of cities in the south, where judges quoted Quranic law, where kings funded schools, and where scribes copied books by candlelight. These were not the mutterings of fools. They were records, spread through word of mouth and written travelogues. Mali's reputation became self-sustaining. In Timbuktu, this reputation crystallized. Though Musa's visit had already ignited its spark, his successors fanned the flame. Scholars from Fez, Cairo, and even the Hijaz journeyed south, drawn by stipends, libraries, and patronage. By the late 14th century, Timbuktu had evolved from a stopover town to a true center of learning, a place where ink flowed as freely as gold. Madrasas grew around the mosques, and soon thousands of students filled their halls. The Sankore Mosque, rebuilt under imperial patronage, became the centerpiece of an emerging intellectual network. It was not a single university, but a constellation of learning circles, with masters teaching fiqh, grammar, logic, astronomy, and medicine. Manuscripts became currency of a different kind. They were copied, traded, inherited. Some were works of poetry, others theological treatises, legal commentaries, or translations of Greek and Indian science. Arabic became the language of knowledge, but the soul was distinctly West African. Here, Islamic wisdom blended with Mande storytelling, with Fulani pragmatism, with Sonic precision. Knowledge was not imported whole. It was absorbed, adapted, reimagined. Mali's scholars debated law, not merely recited it. They corresponded with the Islamic world. They were not passive receivers of truth. They were participants in its evolution. And as students returned to their home villages, they carried books, not swords. Ideas, not domination. A generation of literate Africans was being born in the 14th century. Their minds sharpened by both Griot rhythms and Arabic logic. This was Mali's soft-powered education, faith, and a reputation for justice. Meanwhile, its cities prospered. Gao eventually folded into Mali's realm, buzzed with commerce. Djenné, built on a seasonal island, remained a jewel of architecture and trade. Wallata in the east acted as a hinge between desert and savanna. And Niani, still beating as the imperial heart, oversaw it all with steady rhythm. Foreign merchants continued to arrive. Not just Arabs and Berbers, but Jews, Italians, Tuaregs, and traders from far inland. Some brought goods, others brought stories. Some settled, taking local wives and blending into the fabric of Mali's cities. The empire was not a fortress. It was a marketplace of humanity. But even as Mali looked outward, it never lost sight of the local. Farmers still rose before dawn, their fields carved from riverbanks and nourished by seasonal floods. Fishing villages dotted the Niger's edge, their nets drying under the sun like prayer flags. Women ran the markets, strong, sharp, unafraid. They managed finances, negotiated prices, raised children, and preserved culture. And everywhere, griots told stories, not just of the past, but of the present. They sang of Musa's glory, yes, but also of justice handed down in court, of weddings, of famines, of new stars seen in the sky. They grounded the empire. They kept its memory honest. Because Mali's greatness was not just in its gold, its books, or its camels. It was in how it held together. So many languages, so many traditions, so many beliefs. Without violence, without erasure. This was not utopia. Slavery persisted. Inequality remained. Not every ruler was wise, and not every province was peaceful. But the vision endured. Of an empire where wealth flowed without greed, where knowledge travelled without fear, where faith was practiced without force. In an age when many saw difference as danger, Mali chose something else. It chose exchange. And in doing so, it became not just a power, but a mirror. A reflection of what civilization could be when rooted in justice, adorned with learning, and wrapped in the rhythm of its people's songs. Empires do not fall in a day. They fray. They fade. They forget the rhythm that once held them steady. For Mali, the first tremors came not from outside invaders or distant wars, but from within. From the delicate balance between power and legacy, between inheritance and ambition. After Mansa Musa's death around 1337, the crown passed to his son, Mansa Maga. But the son was not the father. The empire, once held together by Musa's charisma, vision, and administrative rigor, began to loosen. Maga was not tyrannical nor cruel, only overwhelmed. The weight of gold, fame, and expanding frontiers was immense. He ruled, yes, but the empire had grown larger than its crown. The years that followed saw a series of short-lived reigns. Brothers, cousins, ministers. Many donned the Mansa's turban, few wore it well. Some were wise, but lacked loyalty. Others had the name, but not the nerve. The Kita dynasty, once a symbol of unity, became a source of tension. Factions emerged. Generals gained more influence. Provincial governors began to weigh their loyalty, not in blood or oath, but in opportunity. Yet even as the court faltered, the empire's machinery continued. Markets remained open. Caravans still crossed the Sahara. Mosques still echoed with prayer. The image of Mali endured in foreign minds, even as its edges began to crack. It was not decline, but uncertainty. The vastness of the empire made it difficult to govern. In the east, cities like Jau began to assert themselves more forcefully. Though still under Mali's flag, the spirit of independence grew. The Songhai people, intelligent, organized, and fiercely proud, started to reimagine their place, not as vassals, but as heirs to their own destiny. Meanwhile, in the north, desert tribes became restless. The Tuareg, always semi-autonomous and fiercely mobile, began raiding trade routes, disrupting the flow of salt and goods. Towns like Walata and even parts of Timbuktu felt the pressure. Mali could no longer respond with swift discipline. Its strength, once central and unquestioned, had become dispersed. And still, the gold flowed, but the veins ran thinner. The bambuk mines began to yield less. The burra fields faced over-extraction. Some sources dried entirely. With less gold, Mali's ability to pay its soldiers, subsidize its scholars, and negotiate its influence weakened. Trade continued, but confidence began to wane. The empire's soft power, its image of justice, wealth, and faith, began to erode at the edges. Foreign envoys reported rumors of corruption, of bribery in the courts, of roads once safe, now plagued by bandits. Timbuktu remained a beacon of scholarship, but even there, the libraries began to stagnate. Manuscripts were still copied, yes, but fewer were written anew. Griots noticed the change. Their songs shifted. They still praised Sundiata and Musa, but they began to speak in cautionary tones. They remembered kings who ruled with arrogance, who ignored counsel, who placed self over people. Their voices, once celebratory, turned more contemplative, less gold, more dust. And so Mali stood, still vast, still wealthy, still revered, but wary. The people felt it. Farmers spoke of tax burdens increasing. Soldiers waited longer for their pay. Merchants, once protected, now hired private guards. Even the marabouts began to question the Mansa's commitment to the Kern's justice. But what truly threatened Mali wasn't war. It was memory. The generation that had walked behind Mansa, Musa's golden caravan, was growing old. Their children remembered stories, not footsteps. Their grandchildren inherited echoes, not experience. The sense of unity that once tied Mande to Fulani, Songhai to Sonink, began to fade. Language drifted, customs diverged. The empire was no longer one people under one drum. It was many voices with no rhythm. And still, the Nile did not flood as it used to. The rains came late. Crops failed in some regions. Famine whispered at the borders. Climate, quiet and merciless, played its part. The empire was not yet falling, but it was leaning. And just beyond the horizon, in the city of Gao, a new force was rising. Watching, waiting, knowing that when a lion sleeps, the hyena does not fear. The lion was not yet dead, but its roar no longer shook the trees. After generations of might, Mali had reached a place all empires dread. Not collapse, but a long and aching quiet. The wealth remained, but thinner. The name remained, but dimmer. It was no longer a rising power. It was an aging giant, noble but unsteady, regal but vulnerable. The people knew. The traders, the scribes, the soldiers, they felt it before the historians ever wrote of it. The roads, once lined with messengers and guarded by troops, now saw fewer patrols. News moved slower. Bandits were bolder. And far from the Mansa's throne, entire provinces began to rule themselves in all but name. In the east, the Songhai city of Gao stirred restlessly. For decades it had grown. Quietly, patiently. Its people had long memories. They remembered their past independence, before Mali swept in under Sundiata's reign. But now, Mali's grip had weakened. The governors no longer sent tribute with the same urgency. The troops from Niani no longer arrived on time. Zhao's rulers saw opportunity. And so in the mid-14th century, as Mali reeled from succession struggles, the Songhai began to rise. It started subtly. Trade routes were redirected toward Gao. Scholars from Timbuktu were invited, flattered, paid. Local militias grew more organized. And one day, almost without notice, the flag of Mali no longer flew above Gao's walls. The empire had lost one of its most important provinces. Yet the Mansas, caught in rivalries, assassinations, and palace conspiracies, could not mount a response. Coup followed coup. Brothers turned on brothers. Ministers ruled from behind the throne. It was no longer the age of noble statesmen. It was the age of the knife in the dark. Mansa Suleiman, who reigned after Musa's son, tried to restore order. He was prudent, devout, and careful. Under him, the empire stabilized, briefly. He strengthened ties with the wider Islamic world, welcomed scholars back into court, and reasserted control over some fractious territories. But when he died, the cycle began anew. By the late 14th century, Timbuktu, that crown jewel of learning, fell into the hands of the Tuareg. Nomadic warriors who had once been partners in trade, now turning to power. Though the city would eventually be reclaimed, the loss was a wound, symbolic and strategic. It was a message. Mali was no longer untouchable, and the world took notice. Travelers and scholars, who once praised Mali's order, now spoke of decay. Ibn Khaldun, the famed historian, wrote of its fading glory. Markets still bustled. Yes, but they lacked the energy of their golden age. Mosques still echoed with prayer, but their roofs showed cracks. The empire had not disappeared, but it no longer led, and from the north, new pressures began to build. The Moroccan Sultanate, ever ambitious, eyed the wealth of the south. In whispers, in maps, in caravan gossip, Mali was no longer a model, it was a target. Meanwhile, the forest kingdoms to the south and west, like the rising Mossi states, pressed Mali's frontiers. They raided, pushed, and held ground. In earlier times, Mali would have responded swiftly. Now, it negotiated, stalled, or ignored them. Its armies were still formidable, but poorly funded. Loyalty among the ranks was fragmented. Some Farbers ruled like kings of their own provinces, independent in action, if not in name, and the people, ordinary people, adapted. They did not vanish with the empire's glory. They turned inward. Villages became more self-reliant. Griots returned to local histories. Trade routes bent away from Nyani toward new powers. The pulse of life did not stop. It simply moved away from the center. Even as decline deepened, beauty endured. The manuscripts of Timbuktu multiplied. The walls of Djenné still rose from the riverbanks. Farmers still tilled the land. Fishermen still cast their nets. Mothers still taught children to memorize verses and tell stories by firelight. Mali's greatness was not erased. It was diluted, spread thin, like gold dust over too wide a plain. It would not be a single blow that ended it, but a slow unraveling. In time, the Songhai, once vassals, now sovereign, would march westward. They would take Timbuktu, Djenné, and finally claim the imperial heartland. And yet, even then, they would build on Mali's legacy, not destroy it. The empire's architecture, its literacy, its faith, all would flow into Songhai's veins. Mali would become a name in the past, but also a foundation, a memory, a beginning. And in the songs of the griots, the Manzas still lived. Sundiata, the lion who walked again. Musa, the king who turned gold into myth. Timbuktu, the city where ink outweighed ore. The empire may have lost its crown, but it had already earned something greater, a place in history. Before the silence of history settled over the Mali Empire, there was a sound, a rustle of parchment, a murmur of verses, the rhythmic tap of a reed pen against smooth leather. In the north of the empire, beyond the dust-choked dunes, where trade and thought converged, there stood a city that defied every lie ever told about Africa. Timbuktu. It rose not in marble, but in mud. It glittered not in gems, but in ideas. It was not the wealth of its gold that made it eternal. It was the weight of its manuscripts. By the 14th and 15th centuries, even as Mali's political heart began to falter, Timbuktu ascended as a world unto itself. Part market, part sanctuary, part university. Its mosques were not only for prayer, they were academies. Its markets sold books besides salt, and sometimes books were worth more. Much of this blossoming began with the seeds planted by Mansa Musa and his successors. After his return from pilgrimage, Musa invited architects and scholars from Cairo, Mecca, and Fez to enrich his empire. One of those men, Abu Ishaq Sahili, is credited with inspiring the construction of grand Sahelian structures, including the Jingareba Mosque, built of sun-baked mud, reinforced with wooden beams, and still standing centuries later. Around that mosque, a network of learning grew. Timbuktu's scholars did not build a single university. They built hundreds of learning circles, called majalis. In courtyards, under trees, within mud-walled libraries, students gathered to learn Quranic studies, fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, grammar, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and history. Teachers recited from memory, then dictated. Students copied, sometimes for hours each day. Manuscripts were the proof of learning, the final step before a scholar could teach others. These weren't mere copies. They were treasures bound in goatskin, inked with soot and sap. Their margins filled with commentary, debate, even poetry. A student's library was not decoration. It was currency, status, passport, and weapon. And Timbuktu's libraries grew vast. Families guarded private collections. Mosques hosted public ones. Entire dynasties of scholars emerged, fathers, sons, and grandsons all copying and debating texts handed down like heirlooms. Some scholars wrote treatises that traveled as far as Cairo, Damascus, and even Istanbul. Others penned letters to kings, offering counsel on justice, war, and trade. The most famous of these intellectual dynasties was the Akit family, whose members served as judges, cadis, advisors, and teachers for generations. Ahmad Baba, one of the most renowned Timbuktu scholars of the 16th century, would later author over 40 books on everything from grammar to theology to biography, and fight to preserve Timbuktu's dignity when it was conquered by Morocco. But even in Mali's prime, the city already radiated light. Foreign visitors were astonished. They came expecting tents and warriors, and instead found scholars quoting Aristotle, libraries brimming with Greek translations, and students debating abstract logic. And unlike the ivory towers of Europe at the time, Timbuktu was open. Students came from Nigeria, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and beyond. Some arrived barefoot with nothing but their memory. They studied for years, often sleeping in mosques, supported by communal charity. Knowledge was not hoarded, it was shared, taught, recited aloud, made living. This was Mali's second empire, not of soldiers and gold, but of scholars and ink, and it held power. When a city can teach the world, it needs no army. When a people can remember everything, they are never conquered. Timbuktu's walls could be breached, but its manuscripts would survive. Hidden in caves, buried in trunks, copied again and again. And it was not just religious or scientific learning. Poetry bloomed. Chronicles were written. Letters were exchanged between cities across the Sahara. Timbuktu was not isolated. It was a node in a global web of thought, tied to the Maghreb, the Hijaz, and the Mediterranean. Women, too, had their place, though not always in public scholarship. Many were literate, especially in merchant families. Some owned books, ran schools, and ensured their sons became Hafiz, memorizers of the Quran. In a world where illiteracy was common, Timbuktu dared to dream otherwise. And through it all, the muezzin's call continued to rise. The reed pens scratched on. The libraries grew heavier. Even as the empire began to dim, the city still burned with thought. Because Mali had discovered a truth deeper than gold empires crumble. Ideas endure. There are empires that fall with flames, and others that vanish beneath silence. But Timbuktu did neither. When the storms came, of conquest, of greed, of forgetting, it held fast, not with weapons or walls, but with something far more lasting: words. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Mali Empire had passed its peak. Its borders had receded, its gold veins thinned. The Songhai Empire, once a subject, now commanded the rivers and roads Mali had once controlled. And, with this shift, even Timbuktu found itself under new rulers. But it did not lose its light. When the Songhai took control, They recognized the treasure they now possessed. Not just a city, but a living library. They didn't destroy Timbuktu. They invested in it. They added to its mosques, supported its scholars, and incorporated its brilliance into their own empire. Knowledge, they understood, was power too. But the greatest test would come from beyond the desert. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, flush with ambitions and jealous of the wealth and fame of the south, dispatched an army across the Sahara. Armed with cannons and firearms, the Moroccans swept through Gao, then Timbuktu, and finally Djenné. The Songhai were defeated, and Mali, long faded, could do nothing. It was the end of the great Sahelian empires as they had existed for centuries. The Moroccans expected gold, instant riches, and control. What they found was a complicated web of cities and loyalties, of trade dependent on stability, and of knowledge that could not be mined. Their conquest was swift, but their rule was hollow. They arrested scholars. One of them was Ahmad Baba, perhaps Timbuktu's last great name before the long night. Taken to Morocco in chains, he left behind a collection of over 1,600 manuscripts, his personal library. Even in exile, he argued for his people, debated Moroccan scholars, and wrote. Eventually released, he returned to Timbuktu. But the world had changed. Still, the manuscripts remained, some hidden in walls, others buried in sand. Families passed them down in secret. Fathers told sons, "Protect these. They are more valuable than camels, than coins, than kings." Even after the Moroccans left and the city shrank, and trade routes shifted to the Atlantic, and European maps once again erased Timbuktu or turned it into a myth, the books endured. For centuries, they slept. Until, in the modern era, whispers of a hidden African library stirred Western scholars. Expeditions were launched. Some came looking for gold, still chasing Musa's shadow. Others came with curiosity. They found not piles of treasure, but rooms filled with books. And they were stunned. Manuscripts in Arabic, in Ajamis, African languages written in Arabic script, on law, medicine, astronomy, botany, ethics, politics. Some were hundreds of years old. Some were exact copies of texts once thought lost. Others were uniquely African. Commentaries, stories, observations rooted in the land and spirit of the Sahel. Timbuktu had been more than a city. It had been a university without walls, a silent resistance, a light hidden under centuries of sand. And when extremists came again, in the 21st century, burning shrines and threatening libraries, the people of Timbuktu responded the way their ancestors had. They hid the books, carried them at night, packed them in rice sacks, smuggled them across rivers. Thousands were saved, carried not by warriors, but by librarians, because Timbuktu's true army was always its scholars. And Mali's final empire, the empire of the mind, had not fallen. Even today, preservation efforts continue. Manuscripts are being digitized, studied, translated. They reveal not only Mali's glory, but the intellectual life of an entire region. They prove what the world forgot, that Africa wrote, taught, reasoned, dreamed, and still does. So when we speak of Mali, let us not mourn its fall. Let us remember its final defiance. That in a city of mud and light, beneath a mosque built by hand, behind a wooden door, under the watchful eyes of those who remembered, there was a book, and inside a story, and inside that story a world. When the dust settles on kingdoms, and the gold is gone, and the throne sits empty, what remains is faith, not just in the divine, but in memory, in rhythm, in ritual, in things unseen but deeply felt. In Mali, that faith had many names, many voices, but it beat with one heart. Islam had come to Mali not through conquest, but through commerce. It was carried in the saddlebags of Berber traders, whispered in the quiet of desert nights, recited softly beneath the stars. It arrived with gold and salt, but it stayed for something deeper, a shared sense of justice, knowledge, and belonging. By the 13th century, Islam had taken firm root among the empire's elite. The court of Sundayata Kita, though respectful of the old traditions, began to weave Islam into its fabric. By the time of Mansa Musa, the embrace was public, proud, and profound. But Islam in Mali was not a mirror of Mecca. It was a tree grown in Mande soil, its branches broad, its roots deep in the land. Mali's version of Islam was layered, not imposed. In the cities, one could hear the call to prayer echoing from mud, brick minarets. Judges, cadis, ruled by Sharia. Scholars debated Quranic interpretations, and Arabic became the language of law and learning. Mosques marked the rhythm of daily life, but beyond the cities, in the villages tucked beneath baobab trees and along riverbanks, Islam danced with older traditions. Here, marabouts learned spiritual guides, walked the line between worlds. They knew the Quran by heart, but they also knew the drum patterns that summoned the ancestors, the herbs that healed fevers, the rituals that comforted the grieving. They were healers, mediators, teachers. They wrote talismans on scraps of parchment, led prayers at graves, and taught children to recite the divine names of God. Their faith was not diluted. It was fused. The Islam of Mali was not a foreign garment worn for show. It was woven into the skin, and the people did not abandon their stories. The griots, guardians of memory, continued their songs. They honored Sundayata's prophecy, Musa's pilgrimage. The battles won and the betrayal survived, and though they did not speak of prophets, they told truths of honor, humility, patience, courage, values that Islam embraced, not erased. The two voices, Islam and tradition, did not shout over each other, they harmonized. In a Mali village, a boy might begin his morning in a Quranic school, tracing letters into a wooden tablet with charcoal, reciting Surah al-Fatiha until it hummed in his chest. That evening, he'd sit by a fire, listening to a griot's tale of a lion who became a man, or a river that could sing. This was not contradiction. It was continuity. Festivals followed the Islamic calendar, Ramadan, Eid, but also followed the seasons. Drums still marked births and deaths. Women still braided meanings into hair. The rhythm of the people pulsed through both crescent and drumbeat. And in the court, this spiritual harmony found form. Mansas built mosques, sponsored scholars, and travelled to Mecca. But they also respected the Council of Elders, the guardians of Mande law. Justice in Mali often blended Islamic law with customary practice, not out of confusion, but from wisdom. People are not scrolls to be rewritten. They are rivers to be guided, and so Mali became a model. Other empires looked south and saw a land where Islam did not erase culture, but elevated it. Where scholars walked beside storytellers, where justice was both divine and human. Even the griots, over time, began to quote the Quran, and the marabouts began to speak in proverbs. And the people began to see that faith was not a foreign sword, it was a shared light. When empires begin to wane, when the gold thins and the borders crack, it is not always the armies that hold the people together. It is the faith. and the rituals that wrap the soul in meaning. In Mali, as the centuries passed and the empire shifted hands, from Kita to the Songhai, from the Manzas to regional lords, it was Islam that endured as the quiet spine of society. Not because it ruled with fear, but because it answered the questions people kept asking, even as palaces crumbled. What is right? What is just? What is the meaning of all this? The scholars of Mali, the judges, teachers, marabouts, answered not with weapons, but with verses, with the hadith, with carefully weighed rulings, shaped by centuries of Islamic jurisprudence and softened by local wisdom. These were not abstract theologies. They were daily decisions: how to settle land disputes, how to divide inheritance, how to forgive an offense without blood. And unlike in many empires, the scholars here were not hidden behind thick palace walls. They were in the market, in the mosque, in the shade of a neem tree, accessible, respected, human. They did not merely recite, they interpreted. Islam in Mali was not just memorized, it was lived. And alongside them walked the marabouts, whose role blurred the lines between religion and life. They guided the sick, counseled the troubled, protected travelers with charms and due, as written in delicate script and folded into leather pouches. Their houses were small, but their wisdom was vast. They did not claim power, but they had it, all the same. A mother in Timbuktu might visit the mosque to pray for her child's health, and then visit a marabout to receive a charm for protection. A merchant might begin his journey with a Quranic blessing, but also scatter a few grains of millet in the old way, for the unseen, for the known and the forgotten. These acts were not seen as betrayal, but as layers of trust in a layered world. And yet, despite this blending of belief, Islam in Mali never lost its core. The Quran was central. Its verses were etched into memory, sung into the bones of children. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was honored. His teachings transmitted not just in text but in behavior, in generosity, patience, courage, and humility. Friday prayers were sacred. The mosques, whether in Niani or Djenne, filled with barefoot men and boys, their heads bowed, their hearts turned not north, not south, but toward Mecca. The sermons reminded them not of conquests, but of justice, of zakat, of honesty in trade, of respect for neighbours, kindness to strangers, and care for the poor. And the justice system, though weakened by imperial decline, still carried echoes of sacred duty. Judges were often trained not only in law, but in ethics, and even when the Manzas faltered, the people knew the law of God still stood. In many towns, disputes were settled by imams, not soldiers. Women, too, found space in this spiritual rhythm. They were traders, property owners, sometimes teachers. In cities like Timbuktu, daughters of wealthy families studied at home, memorized Quranic passages, and preserved their families' manuscript collections. Some women were revered as pious elders, sought out for advice, their prayers believed to carry weight. Even slaves, though bound by unjust chains, were often taught the faith. In Islam, they were considered human souls before all else. Some rose in status through piety and learning. Others, upon conversion, were promised better treatment and even manumission. It was far from perfect, but the faith offered dignity even in darkness. And perhaps the greatest proof of Islam's deep root in Mali was in its resilience. When Moroccan soldiers sacked Timbuktu, the people hid their cairns. When European maps forgot Mali existed, the mosques still filled with prayer. When the empire fractured into pieces, the call to prayer never stopped echoing across the Niger. Islam had come with merchants, had grown with kings, had blended with stories, but it remained because the people had claimed it. It was theirs. And long after the palaces fell, long after the last Mansa's name faded from memory, a shepherd boy on the Sahel might still stop at sunset, unroll his mat, and whisper, Bismillah, Rahman, Rahmanal, Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, long after the banners fall, after the swords rust and the borders fade into wind, what remains of an empire is not stone or steel. It is song. And Mali, even in decline, never lost its voice. It sang through griots, those living libraries who remembered when kings were children, who held in their minds the victories and wounds of generations. They did not write with ink or fight with blade, but their words were sharp and their memories sacred. They were not poets, they were witnesses. A griot could recite the lineage of a family back 10 generations. He could speak of the day Sundayota crossed the river, of the oath sworn in the Mandé hills, of the Mansa who dreamed of Mecca before the world knew his name. And he would do it not with silence or stillness, but with rhythm. Drums behind him, core in hand, the air thick with memory. They were born into it. Griot families were griot for centuries. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters. Every note mattered, every pause had weight. To be a griot was not a profession. It was a calling, a sacred trust. And even as Mali fractured, the griots kept singing. In villages far from the imperial court, they still told stories of Sundayata, of the hunters from Du, of Mansa Musa's caravan, golden and glorious. Children sat wide-eyed beneath the stars, hearing tales of courage, betrayal, love, and sacrifice. And in those tales, the heart of Mali beat on. But it wasn't only the griots. Music, in Mali, was everywhere. It hummed through the fields, as farmers tilled the soil. It pulsed in the markets, as traders shouted prices. It whispered in courtyards, as mothers lulled their babies to sleep. It was in the way people spoke, tones rising and falling like verse. Language itself was a kind of melody. The kora, with its long neck and stretched skin, told stories without words. The balafon, ancestor of the xylophone, echoed with joy and sorrow alike. The ngoni, small and powerful, struck the air like lightning. Mali's music was not background, it was life itself. And it travelled. Across borders, across centuries. West African rhythms shaped the sound of entire continents. The griot tradition would echo through the blues of the American South, through Cuban percussion, through the jazz clubs of Harlem, unseen, unnamed, but alive. Language, too, carried the empire forward. Though Arabic ruled the mosques and courts, the Mandé languages, Bambara, Sanink, Malink, carried the people's soul. Proverbs wrapped wisdom in metaphor. Everyday phrases whispered ancestry. A simple greeting could unfold into history. How is your family? How is the rain? How are the ancestors? These weren't formalities. They were rituals, connections across time. And even today, when Mali is a modern nation and no longer an empire, these languages persist. They are not museum pieces. They are spoken, sung, lived. Even Mali's architecture spoke a cultural language, the Sudano-Sahelian style, with its thick walls, wooden beams, and monumental presence, wasn't just for beauty. It was for heat, for sand, for prayer. The great mosque of Djenné, reborn each year in a communal act of plastering, is not a relic. It's a living structure, shaped by the hands of many, renewed by memory. Culture in Mali was not elitist. It was shared. And perhaps that's why it survived. Empires that build walls forget their people. But Mali built stories, and stories walk. So even when the empire vanished from maps, even when scholars debated whether it truly existed, even when history tried to forget, a child somewhere still sang of Sundayata. A drum still echoed over a dusty courtyard. A griot still whispered into a microphone. And the wind still carried the name Mali. Time moves forward, but not all stories are buried beneath its weight. Some rise with it, growing taller, louder, clearer with each passing generation. In Mali, the empire may have faded, but its echo never ceased. It moved from memory to music, from village fires to satellite signals, from griot chants to vinyl records and digital tracks. It survived by evolving, and in doing so, it never died. Today, the griot still speaks. He no longer sits only beneath the baobab. Sometimes he stands on a stage, holding a microphone instead of a kora. He performs in Bamako, in Paris, in New York. The rhythms are older than the language they're sung in. The melodies reach deeper than the instrument that carries them. But the mission is the same, to preserve memory. And now, griots are not only men. Women, too, called griots, have taken the stage, telling stories once whispered in kitchens or sung during births and marriages. Their voices rise in weddings, in public festivals, in recording studios. They hold the weight of lineage, the fire of pride, and the duty to remember out loud. Their audiences have changed. Wider now, more diverse, some who do not speak Mande, some who have never walked on West African soil. But when they speak of Sundayata, or Musa, or the days of gold and learning, they still command silence, because something eternal stirs in the rhythm of their tales. And they are not alone. Mali's culture has become the seedbed for modern West African identity. Its music flows through Afrobeat, Mandi jazz, desert blues, and beyond. Legends like Ali Farka Touré, Salif Keita, Omo Sangare, and Fatoumata Diawara carry the spirit of the empire in every note, blending tradition with innovation. Ancient lyrics with electric guitars. They do not simply sing, they summon. And across Mali's cities and countryside, the rituals endure. Weddings still echo with balafon melodies. Children still learn proverbs from elders. The rain is still greeted with songs of joy. Even the clothes, bold, geometric, radiant, speak history. To wear a bazin robe dyed in indigo is to wrap oneself in legacy. In rural villages, oral storytelling continues. Not in hushed tones, but as community theatre, as nightly ritual, as shared inheritance. Children learn history not from textbooks, but from living people. And even as screens flicker in every home, the stories still matter. Because they belong to them. They are not borrowed. They are born here. And that pride, that deep, unshakable pride, is Mali's most enduring empire. It lives in the resistance of its people against foreign erasure. When European historians once scoffed at tales of golden caravans and learned cities, it was the griots who insisted. We remember. And when archaeologists unearthed what oral historians had preserved for centuries, they found not myth, but truth. And so, the story of Mali is not just about what was. It is about what still is. It is a reminder that Africa remembers. That beneath every dusty manuscript, behind every griot's smile, under every song's beat, there is a map, not of roads or empires, but of identity. Mali's cultural legacy is not confined to one nation. Its influence touches Senegal, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Niger. Its languages are spoken across borders. Its rhythms are danced from Dakar to Lagos. Its memory is stitched into the diaspora, into Afro-descendant communities across the Americas. Because when people were stolen from their homelands and shipped across oceans, they carried something no chain could hold: the story. And today, from Harlem to Havana, from Bahia to Bamako, that story still rises. Of kings who rode in caravans of gold, of cities that taught before Europe awoke, of griots who never let the silence win, of an empire not of marble, but of memory. Mali lives on, not in walls or crowns, but in song, not in armies or maps, but in identity, not as a ghost, but as a heartbeat. History often bows to silence, but some names refuse to lie still. They rise from the dust, whisper through the centuries, and remind the world of things too easily forgotten. Mali is one of those names. Not just a place, not just an empire, but a legacy, woven through gold and ink, memory and pride, faith and rhythm. To understand Mali is to understand that greatness is not only measured in conquests, nor in castles of stone. It is measured in what endures when the drums fall quiet. And what endured in Mali was vast. It changed the world. In the heart of West Africa, Mali was more than a kingdom. It was a bridge between desert and forest, between traders and scholars, between North African empires and sub-Saharan traditions. It was a corridor through which gold, salt, ideas, and faith flowed like rivers. Its economy stunned the world. Mansa Musa, in his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, distributed so much gold that its value collapsed in Egypt for over a decade. And that wasn't a fable. It was documented by Arab chroniclers and recorded in the ledgers of Mediterranean traders. His appearance on the Catalan Atlas, a European map from 1375, shows him seated on a throne of gold, a crown gleaming, a nugget in hand. This wasn't just artistic license, it was recognition. The West acknowledging Africa, not as an unknown land of savages, but as a powerful civilization, capable of reshaping economies and commanding respect. But Mali's influence wasn't limited to wealth. Its cities, Timbuktu, Djenne, Jo, became sanctuaries of knowledge. At a time when much of Europe struggled to rise from feudal darkness, Mali preserved the light of science, law, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Its scholars debated theology and ethics. Its students memorized Aristotle alongside Hadith. It became a repository of global thought, written in Arabic, translated into local tongues, and archived on fragile parchment that still survives. And yet, for centuries, Western narratives erased all of this. The transatlantic slave trade robbed West Africa of its people, and, worse, of its memory. Colonizers spoke of primitive tribes of barren lands. They drew borders with no regard for kingdoms, kinships, or faith. And they told stories where Mali did not exist, where Musa was a myth and Timbuktu a joke. But truth is stubborn. African scholars, griots, families, and believers kept the story alive through oral tradition, through music, through resistance. And today, the truth has begun to rise again. Mali's influence shaped not only Africa, but the world. Its gold financed trade routes that linked Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its scholars inspired generations of Islamic jurisprudence. Its architecture laid the foundations for a unique Sahelian aesthetic, still seen from Senegal to Niger. Its spiritual synthesis, Islam rooted in Mande identity, set the stage for a model of religious pluralism that would echo across the region. And perhaps most powerfully, Mali left behind a template, a vision of what a just, wealthy, and spiritually grounded African empire could look like. One where rulers made pilgrimage not to conquer, but to worship. One where scribes were honored as much as generals. One where stories were not silenced, but sung. In a world desperate for alternative models of power, Mali offers one built not on brutality, but on balance. Its legacy is also deeply personal. For those in the African diaspora, Mali represents a home of the mind, proof that their ancestors came from greatness, not from chains. That before the plantations and the ships and the whips, there were kings, scholars, griots, and dreamers. For West Africans today, Mali is a source of identity. It lives in their languages, in their celebrations, in their architecture and music. It is not merely a historical fact. It is a spiritual inheritance. And for the world, Mali is a mirror, a challenge to the way history is told. A reminder that civilization did not begin with Greece and end in Europe. That Africa was not waiting to be discovered, but had already discovered itself. Empires end, stones crack, banners fall. But some legacies are too alive to die. Mali is one of them. It lingers, not as ruin, not as ash, but as presence. In the beat of a drum, in the lines of a poem, in the warmth of a prayer at dawn, in the curve of a chorus string, in the child who says, I come from something. Because Mali was not just an empire of gold, it was an empire of dignity, and that dignity still breathes. In modern Mali and in the greater Sahel, there are people who wake each morning under the same sun that once lit Sundiata's path. They farm the same fields, speak the same tongues, walk the same roads where caravans once passed. They do not live in the past, but they carry it. When griots sing today, they do not only tell of what was, they remind listeners of what still is, that their people once ruled vast lands without brutality, that they once traded ideas with Cairo and Fez, that they built libraries while other empires burned them, that their faith, Islam, was not a conquest, but a choice, and that it enriched, not erased, their identity. Mali, in that way, is a form of resistance against colonial lies that painted Africa as dark and backward, against modern despair that says the past holds no pride, against forgetting itself. To remember Mali is to push back, to say we were not always conquered, we were not always in chains. We were once brilliant, and for millions across the African continent and its diaspora, that remembrance is fuel. It lights fires in classrooms, in protests, in songs and essays and films. It is the seed in the minds of students in Dakar, in Chicago, in Lagos, in London. The whisper behind every line of African Renaissance, we had greatness. We still do, but Mali also calls for unity. It reminds us that greatness is not solitary. Sundiata united fractious clans. Musa ruled not just warriors, but merchants, scholars, artists. Mali was built on cooperation, between desert and river, between Islam and tradition, between memory and motion. Today, Mali's name adorns a modern state, fractured by conflict and change. Yet even amid hardship, its people carry the echo of empire. They are not defeated, they are becoming. Each generation must decide, will we let the story fade, or will we continue it? Because the story of Mali was never just about rulers, it was about the people, those who sang, studied, prayed, traded, taught, farmed, and remembered. And they are still here. They speak through the music of Tumani Diabaté, through the resistance of youth uprisings, through the quiet dignity of farmers who recite Quranic verses before sowing seeds. They speak when a child learns their ancestor was not born in chains, but in glory, when a scholar opens a digital manuscript once buried beneath sand, when a greyot sings the sun into rising. Molly lives on, not in the pages of forgotten chronicles, but in the very bones of Africa. Not behind glass in museums, but in the voices of the living. Not as nostalgia, but as identity. So let us end this journey not with silence, but with a blessing. May we remember Sundiata not just as a king, but as a vision. May we remember Musa not just as rich, but as righteous. May we remember Timbuktu not as legend, but as proof. And may we carry Molly forward, not as ruins, but as roots. Because no matter what comes next in history, the empire of memory still stands. And its name is Molly.